and welcome to Science with Nicole. This webinar will be covering Chapter 21, Ecosystems and Environment, specifically focusing on cycles and energy flow. You can find this chapter within the Conceptual Integrated Science ebook. Hopefully, this webinar will help you to understand a little bit about organisms and their environment. We're going to talk a little bit about species interactions and how they interact within their environment, energy flow and ecosystems, and how materials cycle throughout our environments, specifically focusing on the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the water cycle. What you have here is a list of the objectives that you should be able to understand by the end of this webinar or by the end of the chapter readings. So once again, you should be able to understand the role of solar energy in a specified natural process. Be able to analyze how a given substance cycles throughout the environment. Be able to recognize how a specified organism influences the transfer of energy through a given ecosystem, and be able to identify how the transfer of energy between specified trophic levels occurs. So we will be covering section 21.1, organisms and their environment, within the e-textbook. And this section discusses how ecology is the study of how organisms interact with their environment. If you want to study how organisms interact with their environments, you would be an ecologist. The environment includes all environments or biomes include abiotic and biotic components. The term abiotic means non-living and biotic means living components. If you are enrolled in our INT1 course, when you are researching task 2, you will be asked to choose an environment, and you're going to be asked to discuss some of its abiotic factors, which include temperature, rocks, ponds, for example. If you are going to be discussing biotic factors, that includes all living organisms or all living components of that ecosystem. We study ecology at many levels. We study it at the individual level, the population level, the community level, and the entire ecosystem as a whole. You learn a lot more about these different types of levels within an ecology component when you listen to the Studying Organisms and Their Environment webinar. So you may want to check that webinar out as well, because it talks in more depth about each one of these levels and how the species interact with themselves at these particular levels. Because keep in mind, cycles and energy flow only focuses pretty much on the different cycles and how that energy, how species interact within the trophic levels. Section 21.2 of your e-text discusses species interactions. And when we talk about this term interactions, we're talking about how producers and consumers within an environment coexist. One important set of species interaction is who eats what. These relationships are diagrammed in a food chain or a food web. And this food chain or food web contains multiple feeding levels, and those feeding levels are termed trophic levels. So, for example, producers, it's important to understand these terms when you're talking about these food webs. Producers are species that live by making organic materials out of inorganic materials and energy. You talk a little bit about that term organic and inorganic in chapter 12 of your e-text, mentioning maybe in module 5 as well as module 9. What a consumer is consumers obtain food by eating other organisms. So once again, producers are species that live by making organic molecules out of inorganic materials and energy, and consumers obtain food by eating other organisms. So let's look at an example of a food chain or a food web and the species interactions. This figure here is figure 21.4 in your ebook, and it shows organisms at different trophic levels within a woodland community. Okay, and so if you see here decomposers and fungi, and then you have a producer, which is your trees. A primary consumer would be a deer that eats the producer, and then a secondary consumer would be considered a mountain lion, and it's considered secondary because it eats the primary consumer, which is the deer who eats the producer. And then, of course, you have your decomposers such as fungi and bacteria that have their own special role within a food web and food chain. And we'll discuss that a little bit more when we get into our cycles. So this is another example of two other types of food chains. Here you have a terrestrial food chain, and here you have a marine food chain. Here is your producers at the bottom of the food chain. Then you have your primary consumers, which eat the producers, your secondary consumers, which eat the primary consumers, and then your tertiary consumers, which eat the secondary consumers, which eat the primary consumers that eat producers. So you kind of get a feel of what's going on within this food chain. Now, once again, your primary consumers of a community are the species that eat the producers. So for example, herbivores are primary consumers. What do we mean by herbivores? Herbivores eat plants. They don't eat, herbivores are plants, plant eating. Primary consumers are in turn eaten once again by secondary consumers, and these include meat-eating carnivores. So if you're considered an herbivore, you eat only plants, and if you're considered a carnivore, you're meat-eating, okay? Which then may be eaten by tertiary consumers and so forth. So that kind of gives you kind of an insight onto these terms. This here is another example, and this is not found in your e-textbook, but this is a food web within a temperate rainforest. The primary consumers here, so your primary consumers consist of coniferous trees. Your primary producers, okay, consist of coniferous trees, tall Douglas firs, spruce, and cedars, smaller trees and deciduous shrubs, mosses, ferns, grasses, and wildflowers. Those are your producers within this type of temperate rainforest. Then your primary consumers include slugs, snails, centipedes, and many other insects. You would think of small mammals, squirrels, chipmunks, wood mice. They find plenty to eat, as do seed-eating birds. You also have deer that also kind of roam around within these forests. So these would be considered your primary consumers within this temperate rainforest. Your secondary consumers would include insect-eating birds, frogs, and small hunters such as weasels and foxes, some animals such as raccoons and bears, those animals that eat both meat and plants as well. And these are considered your secondary consumers. Your small birds, and then also your large predators, which also could include bears, depending on the type, and cougars and bobcats. form the tertiary consumers, and they eat the smaller animals, of course. Not so much the bears, but the cougars and the bobcats. And this diagram is very good in throwing out there and discussing when we talk about energy flow within a ecosystem. And this diagram shows the number of kilocalories which are available as food at each trophic level. One thing to keep in mind is that only a tenth of the kilocalories which animals eat are turned into meat or biomass when the animals are eaten by their predators. If everything was eaten on a specific trophic level, we would have a lot more extinction of animals. This shows you another example of a food web in a cold desert biome, which is in Antarctica. Antarctica is considered a cold desert. And once again, you learn a little bit more about the different biomes in organisms and their environment. So I encourage you to also attend that live webinar or watch the recorded one. So in this cold desert biome, here's your top predator, which is your killer whale, which in turn eats your secondary consumers and your primary consumers, and of course the primary producers, which are different within a water biome, and they are the unicellular life forms. And then down here, of course, you have your bacteria, ice, snow, and rocks. So I think you kind of get a good idea of some different food webs. So now, at all levels, I mentioned this earlier when we talked about the woodland community, you have dead organic matter, and which is consumed by decomposers such as bacteria and fungi. And this shows you kind of a little bit of how that energy is transferred. You have solar energy, which comes from the sun, which assists the producers who give off oxygen thanks to the decomposers. Giving back to the producers in the environment. And then you have your consumers that utilize the oxygen that gives off carbon dioxide. We are considered a consumer. You want to look at this process. Basically, it's discussing photosynthesis, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few seconds. So energy flow within ecosystems, one thing to keep in mind is that there's a huge amount of energy that is lost as you travel up a food chain. Okay, so make sure to refer to diagram 21.10, which is here in your ebook. And this is because, once again, not every organism at one trophic level is eaten by an organism at the next trophic level. So on average, only about 10% of that energy at one trophic level becomes available to the next level. And the other 90% you can find as uneaten organisms, heat loss to the environment, feces, and maintenance. So what position do humans occupy in the food chain? Most humans are considered omnivores that eat at many levels of the food chain. That's what that means. We eat plants, animals, and some decomposers like mushrooms. I know I enjoy mushrooms in my salad and grilled on hamburgers. So because humans are not preyed upon by other species, we are top predators. So moving forward within your e-text, section 21.4 discusses kinds of ecosystems. And I just want to point out here, because once again, in organisms and their environment, you discuss this a lot more in detail. Earth includes many different types of ecosystems, and they can be found in two broad categories: your terrestrial ecosystems and your aquatic ecosystems. The land area of Earth is divided into these 8 major types of ecosystems, which are called biomes. And once again, you learn more specifically about some details of these in organisms and their environment. And this figure here just shows you, the key down here just shows you the different types of biomes and the continents and where we can find them. Okay, so as we move forward, An important concept to think about when investigating and looking at all these different ecosystems and biomes are the cycles and how that energy flow in all life on Earth um, incorporates with and works together within these specific biomes. And it is the sun that drives all of our this entire, our ecosystems. So the sun is key in the process of photosynthesis, or the process by which plants, which are considered autotrophs, there's another term, plants are autotrophs, make food for themselves. Okay, so photosynthesis assists in plants making food for themselves. Plants form the foundation for nearly all food webs on Earth. If it wasn't for the sun or solar energy, we would not exist. The sun assists these plants, and plants give us oxygen. So it's important to understand this process of photosynthesis. And it's actually a two-stage process. You have a light reaction that occurs and something called a dark reaction. So within the light reaction, the energy from absorbed sunlight is used to split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. And that's what this chemical reaction shows, this process. A dark reaction, because remember, photosynthesis is a two-stage process, is whereby hydrogen from the light reaction combines with carbon dioxide to form carbohydrates. So once again, photosynthesis occurs in two different stages. When you look at this equation, it's important to understand that this side of the equation are your reactants, and they react together to produce these molecules on the right side of the equation. So the left side is your reactants and the right side is your products. Okay, so in photosynthesis, you have carbon dioxide working together with water and sunlight to produce glucose and oxygen. And so it's important to understand this process in comparison to cellular respiration. But because we are basically dealing with cycles and energy flow, and it's photosynthesis that drives that energy, we're just going to focus on photosynthesis. And once again, energy flow within an ecosystem. We take in energy from food for our cells, and we have different molecules of nutrients, and those nutrients are transformed to produce feces, help us to maintain our bodies and our cell and growth and reproduction. So energy taken in from food goes to these three things: feces, maintenance, growth, and reproduction. And this table here, basically, you don't need to know a lot about this table. It's in your ebook, but basically it shows you how productive, the most productive ecosystems that we have on Earth. Rainforests, swamps, marshes, and coral reefs are among the most productive ecosystems on Earth, whereas deserts and tundra are among the least productive. So moving forward, on page 489 of your ebook, you'd start to discuss material cycling. So we're going to look at each of these cycles on an individual basis now. Many substances on Earth travel through a continuous cycle from living organisms to the abiotic environment and back. And this describes our bio-geochemical cycles, which is your water cycle, your carbon cycle, and your nitrogen cycle. So let's take a closer look at our water cycle. And here is a diagram that pretty much depicts what goes on within this water cycle. You have water evaporating from the oceans into the atmosphere. And this water is moved around the atmosphere by winds, convection cells, and you talk a lot about this in atmosphere within module 6 of this course. So water precipitates as rain or snow over the ocean or land. And it moves into our biotic world when it is absorbed or swallowed by organisms. And some of this water then passes up the food chain. Okay, and then the rest is returned to the abiotic environment in a variety of ways. It's returned through animal respiration, perspiration, excretion, and elimination and evaporation from plant tissues. So this basically is the how the water cycles throughout our environment. The next cycle is your carbon cycle, and you see you can follow the arrows as how carbon cycles throughout an environment. And most of the inorganic carbon on Earth exists as carbon dioxide, and it's found either in our atmosphere or in dissolved ocean waters. Now, plants and other producers convert carbon dioxide, because remember we talked about within photosynthesis. And so plants and other producers convert carbon dioxide to glucose during photosynthesis. We as humans, one of our products through cellular respiration is carbon dioxide. So the plants take this carbon dioxide and they convert it to glucose in photosynthesis. And of course, solar energy helps to drive that process. So now carbon is returned to the environment by living organisms, like I just said, such as ourselves. And because this atmospheric carbon dioxide traps heat on the planet, this has resulted in global warming. So it's important to understand about global warming and the greenhouse effect within this section as well. And then you have your nitrogen cycle. And your nitrogen cycle can be a little bit more complex. One thing that's very interesting to note is most of our atmosphere consists mostly of the element nitrogen. Some people would just automatically assume it's oxygen, but it's not. Nitrogen is found primarily as nitrogen gas, and it's the dominant component of the Earth's atmosphere. And so the nitrogen cycle discusses how we use nitrogen in its usable form. So in order for living organisms to make use of this nitrogen, it has to be converted. And to convert it, we rely on bacteria. And it is our bacteria that helps to accomplish this transformation, okay? And nitrogen, and it shows you here how nitrogen is converted to ammonium and by bacteria, and then to nitrates by bacteria. And then it returns to the abiotic environment, follow my arrow, when it is converted back to nitrogen gas. Okay, so this one is a little bit more complex, but it shows you how animals eat the plants, and then the feces, and it decomposes. And so it shows you that whole cyclic pattern of how nitrogen is used in a usable form within the atmosphere. So that brings us now to our your course of study questions. Hopefully this webinar helps you to make comprehension of these course of study questions. So make sure that you answer these guiding questions. And if you should have any further questions, please make sure to contact one of your